Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 7th chapter in the book of Romans. And this chapter can be broken into 3 sections. The first 6 verses, which describes the New Covenant Christians' annulment to the law, it likens it to a marriage, and the Old Covenant Jews were very much married to the Torah or the law. But having died to the self and died to the Torah, they are annulled from that marriage and are free to join the bond of union. It now exists between them and the one who fulfilled the law, Yahshua Messiah. Then in the 7th through the 13th verse, we read some of the purposes and the function of the law, which was to essentially reveal our sin. We'll comment on that more fully. And then in the 14th through 18th, 14th through 25th verse, we're going to try and make it all the way through. Paul describes in a very personal struggle with sin that affects us all. Even the most exemplary saint in human history was not immune to sin. So there's a lot to cover in this chapter, and the one thing we will say before we break it down, beginning in the first verse, is that beginning in the 7th chapter, we witness a change in pronouns. Paul was passionate and concerned for his flocks, so most of the pronouns are we, you, and elsewhere. But in the 7th through the 25th verse, he gets more personal, and he does use himself as a model or an example for them to follow. But throughout the majority of his epistles, he speaks very minimally about himself, but he describes a personal struggle of his in the hopes that they don't have to struggle with them, and similarly, and even if they do, they know that he is struggling right there with them. So that being said, we're going to open with the opening verse, which reads, "Or do you not know, brothers, for I speak to those knowing the Torah, that the Torah rules over a man as long as he lives? There would have been many Jews and Gentiles who came to Christianity as Jewish proselytes. They would have been familiar with the law, and even if they had no prior experience with an Abrahamic religion, they would have been surrounded by Jews in the early assemblies who would have told them all about the law. The law was the greatest thing of the Old Covenant. It was the supreme and most superior form of special revelation, but that is all transcended and superseded by the one who fulfills the law, and Yahshua Messiah is now our fullest and most supreme form of revelation of divinity. The law was a revelation in the sense that it revealed the will and character of Yahweh who issued it and authored it, and the Son was a visible representation of his nature and attributes in human form. For the married woman has been bound by Torah to the living husband, but if the husband dies, she is released from the Torah of her husband. So it would have been adultery for a man or a woman to marry while their living spouse still lived, to get a divorce and remarry, but it wouldn't have been adultery if they were a widow or a widower and picked one up, and that is the analogy that's being related here, with the object of our wedding and union being formerly the law and now having advanced into a superior grade of grace. And grace can do a lot of things that the law cannot do. The law can expose the sins, but it cannot transform the soul. And it reveals the sin, the latent sin nature, which is resident, at least in some sense, in all of us. And the sin nature hears the law and rebels against it. And so there is a law of sin and there is a law of Yahweh. And the law of sin, which is born of Satan, is to do whatever you need to do in order to do what you think is best for you. God is not in the picture at all in the law of sin, but he does have a superior way, which he revealed in the form of a law to his servant Moses, which tells the human nature to act opposite or contrary to its carnal or natural instincts. So then, while her husband lives, she shall be called an adulteress if she becomes another man's. But if her husband dies, she is free from that Torah, so that she is not an adulteress, having become another man's. So he's using a female form of an illustration of this analogy. So the law and the grace is the one that's not mentioned. That is their new husband, and they were at liberty to do so because they had died unto the self and died unto the law. So they were now free to advance into a more advantageous marriage, since the law had died in them and they had died to themselves. So, my brothers, you also were put to death to the law, Torah, through the body of Messiah, for you to become another's, the one who was raised from the dead, that we should bear fruit to Elohim. So the precedent of dying to the law is the atonement, the bitter passion, where the Savior, who was sinless from birth, from all eternity, all the way up till his mortal life and beyond, bore the sin penalty of sinful humanity. He met the wrath of the Almighty that he reserves for sin, and because he did that, we don't have to. So it's truly, he's the original first fruit of the resurrection. He was the first one to die to the law, and he died in order to give us a more supreme form of revelation that we can live by than the law. He fully satisfied it and fulfilled it, and the purpose for which he came is in order that we would bear fruit to Elohim. And this brings us to Paul's 5th chapter in the book of Galatians, the difference of the fruit of the Spirit and the vices of the flesh. For when we were in the flesh, the passions of sins through the law were working in our membership to bear fruit to death. So flesh is morally neutral. The Jewish and Christian people do not have a degraded estimation of the human body, but the flesh is particularly susceptible and vulnerable to the snares and lures of sin, and the world constantly seduces it, and Satan does too. So flesh is in a sense the beachhead for our sin nature, which touches us and then dwells in us. And But like I earlier mentioned, the law of sin operates on a contrary agenda to the law of Yahweh, and the law of sin eliminates totally even the idea of a higher power out of the picture. It leaves us free to, in effect, become our own Elohims, determine for ourselves what is right and what is wrong, and to satisfy and gratify our immediate gratification above all else. That's its preeminent concern. But now we have been released from the Torah, having died to what we were held by, so that we should serve in newness of spirit and not oldness of letter. So the oldness and the newness refers to the old and new covenants. The old covenant was known as the one of law. That was the law that was issued through Moses, which governed and guided the Israelite nation collectively as from the wilderness to the nation. Of course, they did not obey it and honor it perfectly. But the new law is made possible by the bitter passion and the atonement, which was a supreme act of grace. So grace is the silent antagonist, or the new form of marriage that we are re-wedded to. And it is personified in the form of Yahshua Messiah by Paul. And this is, remember, where the pronouns change. So earlier we heard we and all that stuff, but now we hear I. What then shall we say? Is the Torah sin? Let it not be. However, I did not know sin except through the Torah. For also the covetousness, I knew not it, if the Torah had not said, you shall not covet. So Torah gives us, the law gives us an awareness of sin. It tells us what we should do and what we should not do. And what it tells us we should not do is sin. And but the law itself is not sinful, but it gives us a superior alternative to rest on and rely on than our own inclinations, the law of sin. And but it does give the student an awareness. Paul was an ardent student in the ways of the law. He had an advance. He was a young rabbi of promising potential before he was transformed. So he would have been familiar with the law, and the reason he dwells on the final one, the 10th Decalogue, is that it is distinct from all of its predecessors, and that it is an attitude and not an action. So that's something the natural man wouldn't consider. Do not even have the idea in your head that you can steal another man's or lie in order to get what you want, or covet another man's wife and commit adultery. So it all really ties into the beginning of covetousness, and that's something he wouldn't have known through the conscience alone. That's something that was revealed to him by the law. But sin, having taken the occasion through the commandment, worked in me all covetousness. For apart from Torah, sin is dead. So sin, in other words, had its way with him, and in spite of the fact that he had the Torah, the law of sin and the law of Yahweh are always at contradistinction, and Paul sometimes succumbed to the sinful option, maybe not necessarily as frequently or as intensely as certainly the average person who ever lived, or even the average Christian, but he was human just like us, and that leads us into the most humanizing portrait, one of the most humanizing portraits we read of him towards the tail end of the chapter. And I was alive apart from the Torah once, but when the command came, the sin revived, and I died. Sin is equated to death as early as Eden. We die spiritually when we sin, and so as soon as we relapse or lapse into sin, then we renew the process of death, and he came alive apart from the law once. That was his Christian conversion. And the commandment which was to result in life, this I found to result in death. The Jews were instructed to abide by these laws in order to give them long and prosperous life, but all the law did, because they could not honor it fully, was make them die. They bore the wages and consequences of sin, which is death. He had been instructed and conditioned and upbrought to believe and educated to believe that the law was a source of life. He, through his own personal discovery, comes to an opposite conclusion through the lens of maturity than what he had been told as a youth, that the law in fact brings death, not life. And the commandment which was to result, for sin, having taken the occasion through the commandment, deceived me and killed through it. Sin is deceptive by its nature. The fall of humanity came through the serpent's deception. He effectively told Eve that Yahweh was bluffing when he said that they would not die, but he was secretly withholding them information which was desirable for them to become more like him. And so sin deceives us. It tricks us to believing that our immediate gratification can be attained at the compromise of moral and ethical principle. So from start to finish, sin is deceiving, and people pursue it in the misguided assumption that it will bring them greater happiness, but they are often oblivious to the misery it brings, because they still carry its exalted expectation even after it fails to deliver repeatedly. So that the Torah truly is sacred, and the commandment sacred and righteous and good. So he's not, it's from the, without this statement here, it's easy for us to interpret what he had just said as the law itself brings about the death. It's not the law itself, it's the one who lives by the law. They cannot honor it, they will fall short. All have fallen short in Romans 3:23. So the law cannot redeem or transform a soul. All it can do is negatively function as a mirror, which exposes our sin and our need for salvation. But in itself, it is good. It is from Yahweh. It is an expression and revelation of his nature and character. There's nothing wrong with it. The problem is when humans decide to live by it as their guiding North Star. It's certainly more admirable than living without it, but they are to embrace the new and superior way that Paul is expounding upon throughout these epistles. Therefore, has that which is good become death to me? Let it not be. But that sin might be manifest, was working death was working death in me through what is good, so that sin through the commandment might become an exceedingly greater sinner. So he's acknowledging the potential of the law to exacerbate one's sinfulness when we live by rules and regulation. The resident sin nature resists and rebels and outright discards them. So a lot of the Jewish people were given the law to be distinct and exceptional and unique from all the nations that surrounded them. And eventually, when they became more at certain points of their low points of national depravity, they became indistinct from the sunken heathen they had displaced in the land in which surrounded them all about. So they were discarded in according to, or at least exiled in according to the terms of the covenant. For we know that the Torah is spiritual, but I am fleshly, sold under sin. So again, the law is not good, but is good, but we are not. So the Torah is spiritual, but we are carnal creatures. We exist of the flesh. We are, all to varying degrees, vulnerable to its appetites, lures, and desires and gratifications, and that is part of the sin nature, which remains resident in us until we embrace, even if we live under the law, the sin nature will not be eradicated from us. For what I work, I know not. For what I want, that I do not practice. But what I hate, that I do. So there's a dichotomy between the flesh and the spirit and the mind. Paul knows that sin, he doesn't want to do it, yet he finds himself doing it. In spite of his noblest intention, he knows it's wrong, he knows it's not to any long-term advantage, yet he finds himself unable to escape it. And so he's describing himself as fleshly. He was human just like everyone else. He was certainly an exemplary evangelist and a standard saint, but he had to battle with the sin nature and temptation just like every one of us. But if I do what I do not want, I agree with the Torah that is good. So he's talking about doing what he does not want to do. That's the doing of that which he is disinclined against in theory, in spirit, in mind, in soul. But the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak, as the Savior told the sleeping disciples whom he had instructed to stay awake for 1 hour and guard him while he prayed the agonizing prayer in Gethsemane. That is certainly true in other contexts and applications. And now it is no longer I that work it, but the sin dwelling in me. So he's distancing himself from the indwelling sin. Sin makes us do things that are not necessarily reflective of who we are as a person, yet we do them nevertheless. The sin nature does not remain in the born again and regenerate believer, but the sin tendency is always resident. We always are culpable and at least have the potential to succumb to sin, no matter how much we might not want to, no matter how sincere we are in our wish to just live without it for the rest of our lives. It's gonna pop up, and we have to live with that fact and embrace it accordingly, confess, repent, and ask for forgiveness. For I know that in me, that is in my flesh, dwells no good. For to want is present with me, but to work the good I do not find. So he's degrading himself. Now in this section we certainly read the pronoun I a lot more frequently than we do in the epistles of Paul, but he was not a self-concentrated creature. He was submitted to Yahweh and Yahshua and basked in the power of the Ruach Kodesh and was concerned with others. But even so, he just couldn't do it completely or perfectly. For the good that I want to do, I do not do, but the evil I do not want to do, this I practice. So again, he's illuminating or explaining the difference of what he does and what he desires. Our doing seldom or at least never totally or exactly match our desires. We all invariably fall short of our loftiest expectations, and we all do things we regret, but we let our past mistakes shape us without totally defining us. We make the mistakes don't make us. And if I do that which I do not want, it is no longer I who work it, but the sin dwelling in me. So this says much of what he said before in verse 17, and this is just the negative and positive polarity of the presentation. I find therefore this law, that when I want to do the good, that the evil is present within me. So even the sincerity of desire, which wishes no ill, which wishes no sin, the evil nature is still present and latent and resident, and he's constantly battling with it and contending it. To walk on the path is to be engaged in spiritual warfare in all ways and at all places at all times. Because once you become a Christian, you have a target on your head, a bullseye target that the adversary is going to try and sling his arrows, because the skull of a born-again believer is his greatest prize and possession of those he claims for eternal damnation. For I delight in the law of Yahweh according to the inward man. So as a Jew, he was particularly zealous for the traditions of his ancestors. He was an ardent apologist for the law as the supreme form of revelation. He initially rejected the higher form of revelation, which came in the form of Yahshua the Son. And it is a source of delight. Still, even after a Christian, he still takes delight in doing it according to the inward man. So it involves a renunciation of the outward flesh, and you can do it through the Spirit indwelling in you that makes you obey. When in Galatians 5, he quite clearly says that the fruits of the Spirit, there is no law against it, because that which is done in the Spirit is always in harmony and consistent with that which we read of in the law. But I see another law in my members, battling against the Torah of my mind, and bringing me into captivity to the law of sin, which is in my members. So the members of the flesh, that would be the appendages and body parts, all connected to the same flesh, they operate according to their own desires. They seek their gratification and satisfaction and fulfillment of its wants, needs, and desires, and immediate gratification. All of the flesh longs for it, and this is the law that they operate to it. But there exists a higher law, the Torah of Paul's mind, which springs from the mind and heart of Yahweh, which tells us that you don't have to do what you think is best, do what Yahweh wills. So that it's a constant struggle to maintain the superior, to be on the already victorious side in the cosmic struggle between good and evil. We are never more than a step away from succumbing to evil at any given moment in time. Wretched man that I am, who shall deliver me from this body of death? So this is in itself, interpreted in isolation, a statement of discouragement, distraught, and devastation, because he knows that he is doomed in his sin and in his flesh, and who is going to deliver him? Who's going to provide the salvation from his body, which is contaminated by sin, leading unto death? And the answer is that none of us and ourselves can do it. The only thing any of us contribute to our salvation is the sin which we are being saved from. It is wholly a divine initiative and ministry from start to finish, the actual salvific process. Thanks to Yahweh, through Yahshua Messiah our Master. So then, with the mind, I myself truly serve the Torah of Yahweh, but with the flesh, the law of sin. So he's expressing gratitude that Yahweh in his mercy has provided our Son to be our propitiation, our vicarious atonement, to deliver us from sin and death, eternal death. and he's once more highlighting the law of Yahweh, which is at dichotomy in war and conflict with the flesh of the law, but through consistent yielding and constant diligence and discipline, we may serve the superior over the inferior to our benefit and to our victory. And I hope that's why you're here. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'll see you soon. Take care until then. Bye-bye.